Now in this section, we'll talk about DMVPN phases, phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3, just a basic introduction, how they exactly differ. Now phases are actually the different ways of implementing your DMVPNs. So let's start with the phase 1. Now DMVPN phase 1 is something we don't use in today's networks. Now how it's going to work, how the phase 1 is configured. Now in the phase 1, what we are going to do is on the router 1, we are going to configure a multi-point GRE implementation. So which means we have a single source and we can have multiple destinations, but whereas on the spokes we are going to use a point-to-point GRE implementations. So here we are going to configure a point-to-point, point-to-point and point-to-point implementations. So that's what we call them as phase 1 implementation. Now how it's going to differ from phase 2, we'll talk about phase 2 more in detail. Now what it is going to do is, in case of phase 1, there is no spoke-to-spoke tunnels are established. Now you have a tunnel established from router 2 to router 1, you have a tunnel from router 3 to router 1, and you have a tunnel from router 4 to router 1. But you will not have any tunnel establishment between spoke to spoke. So which means all the traffic which is supposed to go from router 2 to router 3, let's say the router 2 want to communicate with router 3, they should go to the router 1, and from the router 1 again it will be sent back to router 3. So all the traffic has to go via hub, that is router 1, and it is something we don't use in today's networks, and the main reason is there is no spoke to spoke tunnels created here. So it's a simple hub and spoke topology where you can have a dynamic IP address on the spokes. Now you can have a dynamic IP address on the router 2. We can also have a dynamic IP here, but on the hub you must have a static IP address. Now the static IP address or the next hop server IP address should not change, but we can have a dynamic IP address in the phase 1 or phase 2 in both. So all the traffic has to go via hub. So in simple words, phase 1 is something what we use multi-point GRE on the router 1, whereas we use point-to-point and normal GRE we use on the spokes. But whereas in case of phase 2, the phase 2 we use multi-point GRE everywhere. So we'll be using multi-point GRE on the router 1, and also we'll be using multi-point GRE on the router 2, as well as on the router 3, as well as on the router 4. Now if I use multi-point GRE, what is the main advantage we get? Now we can have a dynamic tunnels can be established from router 2 to router 1, router 2 to router 3, and router 2 to router 4. Similar way, if you're using multi-point GRE everywhere, we can have a tunnel from router 1 to router 2, router 1 to router 3, and router 1 to router 4. Like that we can have a full mesh dynamic tunnels can be established between each and every spoke, spoke to spoke as well as spoke to hubs. Okay, so it allows you to have spoke to spoke tunnels can be created. That is one of the major reason we prefer to go with a phase 2 when you compare with phase 1. Now again, there is something called NHRP, next hop resolution protocol, is really required for you to have spoke to spoke communication. Now to have a spoke to spoke tunnel created dynamically, we need to have some NHRP protocol, and the spoke is going to send a query message to the server is going to provide the information about the client, the NBMA address or the public IP address, whatever we are using here, and based on that it will build a dynamic tunnel from spoke to spoke. Now dynamic DMVPN phase 3, now phase 3 allows you to just a slight enhancement of the phase 2 we can say. Now in case of phase 3, we are going to use a command called NHRP redirect on the server here. What it is going to do is it is going to indicate the current path, that the current path is not the optimal path. Like the router 2, initially the traffic will go to router 1 and it's sent back on the router 3, and later on it will be going directly from router 1 to router 3 once the tunnel is established. Now in case of phase 3, what we are going to do is we are going to configure a command called IP NHRP redirect, which is going to indicate the current path is not the best path, and the receiver of that particular message, that is our spoke, is going to find the better path for the destination. So we are going to add some one command, that is only that one command is going to differentiate between the phase 2 and the phase 3. So let me just quickly revise between the phases here. Now in case of phase 1, we are going to use multi-point GRE on the hub, whereas we are going to use point-to-point GRE implementations on the spokes. But whereas in case of phase 2, we are going to have multi-point GRE everywhere. So everywhere we are going to use multi-point GRE on all the spokes as well as on the hubs. So in case of phase 1, we can have only tunnels established from spoke to hub, and there is no tunnel establishment between spoke to spokes. Whereas in case of phase 2, we can have spoke to spoke tunnels can be created. In case of phase 3, we are going to use a command called IP NHRP redirect, which is going to indicate that the current path is not the best path. So probably the receiver of that particular message has to find the better path to that destination.